Hi there! Welcome to Sound and Fury Book Reviews. I'm Tina, and this is kind of odd, but I did the reviews for January in August. I started doing wrap-ups in February for my other channel that's now defunct. So I decided I would fuse my February to June reviews into one video. It was way too long, so I decided I'd create a January wrap-up from my notes, and because I still remember these books to a large extent, and then I'd have a January to March and an April to June kind of collection. Okay, I mainly did this because I want to talk about this book called Old Rendering Plant because I love it, but whatever, that's basically what's going on here and why, you know, I have a haircut from August when I don't have that haircut in February. Anyway, here we go. I hope you like it. Whatever. So the first book that I read in January was The Brightest Fell by Nupur Chowdhury. I received a copy of this novel from the author in exchange for a fair review. She reached out to me on Goodreads and she seemed like a very nice person. So this novel is self-published. It's a very solid, exciting political thriller set in a slightly in the future, making it kind of a sci-fi, but it's more of just kind of it's more speculative fiction. So the plot is that one of the characters, Zieja, designs a drug that can curb the instinct for violence, but it also robs the taker of their free will. So the story starts 15 years after he's created this, when a terrorist attack happens where the terrorists are intending to steal the drug. There's a lot more than this. That's just kind of the start. The story is more of a political thriller about Zieja's motives, his power, and then about control and betrayal, and then these two siblings that are kind of bent on revenge against him, but then also aren't sure if they do want revenge against him. It's hard to explain without giving a lot of it away, but it's really interesting. And I don't tend to read political thrillers that often, but I really, really enjoyed this one. And I especially drawn to a location that wasn't the US, because I try to read more broadly, but, you know, sometimes I just don't think about it. But it was great to have a political story set somewhere else. I'm not sure whether the political setup in the novel was fictional or based on reality, but either way, it was designed in a way that seemed realistic. And, you know, there's almost no sci-fi in this book other than the creation of the drug. So, as I said, I would consider it more speculative fiction. The book, though, is finely tuned and it's a testament that self-publishing is a viable route to go. It's really well done. The characters are fun. It starts off with a lot of men, but then quickly a lot of women show up. And, you know, I need that in my books. And there's some queer representation as well, which is great. You know, the characters could have had a little bit more backstory. Like, siblings were really close, but I wasn't sure kind of why. Did something bring them together? And, you know, why are all of the power-hungry people such sociopaths? Is there anyone in the book that isn't? So I would have liked to see that, but also might have bogged down the story a bit. I also could have used more conflict between Abi regarding Zieja. He kind of resolves his issues a bit quickly. One thing that threw me off, though, about the book was the jumps in time. It's very clearly marked at the start of a section, whether it takes place months or weeks later, but I had time orienting myself that so much time had passed, as the characters don't really change over the course of those missing chunks. The time passing also didn't seem to have any bearing on the story. It seemed to move the same way, whether things happened a month later or a month before. So the time shifting I didn't really understand. I did enjoy all the twists and the turns in the plot. You know, I was never sure what Zieja was up to, nor who he was allied with or not. And what I liked best was there was no hyperbolic kind of like save the world moment that often appears in political thrillers, or at least in the political thriller movies that I've seen. So this is a drama that's isolated to kind of the upper echelons of the government for the most part, but there are real repercussions for those in, you know, the regular population. Overall, it's a tightly wrought, quick-moving political thriller that addresses corruption in a way that is both poignant and entertaining. I give it a 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I recommend it to anyone who likes political thrillers or just near-future speculation. It's really good. The second book I read in January was Psychodrome by Simon Hawke. I found this thing at a used bookstore for $2, and I clearly bought it for the title and for the lovely back picture here. It's a cyberpunk action, you know, action adventure. I reviewed it for my old school sci-fi blog, meaning I did a feminist analysis of it and tore it apart. So Psychodrome, I'm going to read you what the back says. An intergalactic scavenger hunt that sends its players across the stars in a game player. What? Okay. Psychodrome. An intergalactic scavenger hunt that sends its players across the stars in a game playing for keeps. A game where the lines between reality and computer-generated fiction blur, and the only thing is that there is no sure thing. Now, Arcadia O'Toole has entered Psychodrome. A gambler down on his luck, O'Toole hopes to pick up quick cash and avoid some nasty characters that he's accidentally crossed. But his past has allowed him into the game, and he and his teammates soon find out that Psychodrome doesn't kill them, reality will. This novel, this novel is detail heavy, overly expository, and has trouble maintaining any sort of tension. That being said, you know, the world building and the technology are super well developed, and they're the only things really that kept me reading about the story, because those are quite well done. The main character is one of those almost too perfect people. You know, he's so introspective, so accepting of others' attacks or misuse of him. He always comes to the right conclusion on things, which makes him very, very boring. His friend Breck, who should be a fascinating character, given he is a bioengineered soldier with a complex moral system, goes on so many monologues that you begin to skim whenever he speaks. There are 2 women in the novel, or there's 3, whatever, 2, one doesn't say anything. Stone and Kami actually have dialogue. There are 2 of only 3 women, I said. All of the women in the novel sleep with the main character at some point, and these 2 women are carbon copies of one another who do nothing to drive the plot. So that's unfortunate. It's even more unfortunate because the setup is so cool, and as I said before, the world building is so good. It's like everything in the story, the characters, the attempts to bring up heavy topics like genocide and racism, you know, the way that society is socially progressed, and even the plot are all competing with one another for attention, which leaves them all feeling really half-baked. Anyway, I appreciated the attempt of the story. I could see what he was trying to do, but it just came off so heavy-handed that it didn't work in terms of being entertaining. You know, especially a book with such a ridiculous, though, I mean, it's awesome, title. Psychodrome, you know, more like Boredrome. Was that too heavy-handed? Yeah, well, try reading Psychodrome. 2 out of 5 stars. I recommend it only to the most hardcore cyberpunk fans. Like, you have to love cyberpunk to want to read this. And if you like it, good for you. I found it boring. Anyway, the 3rd book that I read was Bridge 108 by Annie Charnock. I cannot pronounce anyone's last names. I received this as an ARC from NetGalley in exchange for a fair review, and I read it on my phone because I didn't even have a Kindle back then. Like 9 months ago or whatever. So late in the 21st century, there's drought and wildfires, and there's this huge exodus of people from southern Europe. So you have 12-year-old Caleb who gets separated from his mom on their trek north, and he falls prey to traffickers. So they enslave him in this kind of area outside of Manchester, but he's like this resourceful and determined kid, and he just wants to kind of elevate himself in the world. He doesn't really try to find his mom or anything, but he just tries to get himself out of this kind of situation. So he gets, you know, he befriends another victim of trafficking, and he and them escape. And so he starts to kind of see what the world is actually like and try to find other people like him to kind of be part of his new family. But it's not easy. So this is a poignant and very timely story about forced migration, unlawful immigration, and the hurdles that everyone faces trying to adapt to systems that are inherently antagonistic to us. For these people, for sure, you know, the game is totally rigged from the start, to quote Fallout New Vegas. And this is a book that is both, you know, disheartening and hopeful at the same time, because it's got these interesting and sympathetic characters, and it doesn't, like, try to point fingers, it doesn't try to, like, argue something specific, is just trying to show kind of what life could be like for people in this kind of situation. So there's shifting perspectives in the story that make it very interesting. You know, had the whole thing been in Caleb's point of view, it would have gotten very tedious, but instead we're given a child's perspective for a little bit, and then it shifts between him and a bunch of adults, all of whom then encounter him at different times. So the story follows Caleb 100%, but we get other people's kind of impressions of Caleb, and it's really interesting because this allows Caleb in his sections to fill in the blanks. But as a child, we understand his misconceptions and what's going in. We also see why the adults, you know, make the choices that they do. It's a really well done way of doing it. You know, someone who could seem like hostile or too harsh with Caleb is later revealed to have made a mistake or a misconception, things like that. It's really good. The author also put a lot of thought into what life would be like for people living in different levels of this new social hierarchy. You know, we're giving a view to the indentured kind of paid workers, the leaders, the civilians, even the well-off people at one point. These all build a really interesting yet completely feasible future, especially given what's going on now with wildfires and natural resources and climate change around the world. I would have liked a little more exposition, maybe even later in the story, as to what these disasters are, you know, how other countries are handling refugees, and perhaps a chapter with someone in the government instead. You know, I understand that these chapters all follow Caleb, so some of these things don't make sense, but there's probably a way to show a broader view of the situation, you know, because the it would have been kind of neat to see that too. But I started only kind of mildly interested in the story, but ended up wholly impressed by the subtle intelligence behind what it was trying to say, as I said, about migration, especially in a world where something like 1 billion coastal dwellers are going to be displaced by global warming in the next decades. Like, where are they going to go? Like, this story could easily be their future, which is terrifying. So nothing about Caleb's journey was melodramatically terrible, and I mean, it wasn't pleasant for him, but there's nothing really triggering this book, which is nice. It also kind of shows why people would just put up with the kind of situation they're living in, because if you're not being beaten down, you're just kind of held in place, you're less likely to fight back. Kind of like what we can endure, we just kind of accept after a while. And I mean, honestly, this book, really good. 4 to 5 stars. I recommend it to anyone, really. Anyone could kind of read this and get something from it. My hat magically changed. The 4th book that I read that month was Epic Solitude, A Story of Survival and a Quest for Meaning in the Far North by Katherine Keith. I also received this as an ARC from NetGalley, and I read it on my phone because it was a pre-Kindle purchase. And given this was filmed like 7 months and 1 pregnancy later, it's been a while since I've read this book, but I still talk about it. Like, I read it back in January, now it's August, I talk about it all the time. If you want a memoir that'll, keep you saying like, what, all the time, like your Little John or something, this is seriously one of them. And it's not, it's not always in a good way. This woman's life is intense. So the story, or the memoir, is about a free-spirited woman who moves up north to become a dog sled racer. I mean, if that doesn't intrigue you, I don't know what else would, but it's about so much more than that. So it's an engaging and at times like heartbreaking memoir about a woman and her love of the outdoors. It was a lot different than I was expecting. There's a lot less focus on dog sledding than on the trials in her personal life. But that's not a bad thing, because her story at times is both devastating but told with such honesty that it's really hard to put it down. She writes with this openness and clarity that you can tell is genuine. She doesn't try to sugarcoat anything or make excuses for things that happen with her life. That being said, I could have dealt with a different structure to the story. The actual dog sled races in the second half are broken up by longer chapters about her life 15 years prior, but this really distracted from the races themselves and made them all kind of blend together. I mean, I guess though, other than a few interesting things that happen in each race, I'm sure most of the dog sledding be a little bit boring though, reading about it. I mean, a lot of it's just like long stretches in the wilderness broken up by resting or some crazy thing happening. I would love to try dog sledding one day. It's on my list of something to do like in the next 3 years. I would love to go dog sledding. So stronger than the dog sledding sections are about her trying to make a life in the wilderness. I could have used a lot more description about the area. I'm sure if I'd been using like a proper Kindle, the photos would have helped explain. And I mean, we know what the wilderness looks like. There's also this growing focus in the novel on her spiritual journey. This might be really great for some people. For me, this is something I tended to skim, but there wasn't too much of it that it felt like she was trying to shove it down my throat or that it was bored. It's clear that, she's not trying to convince anyone to join her way of thinking, but to show kind of one of the methods she used to, fix herself psychologically, not fix, but you know what I mean, after her numerous traumas. Overall, it's a very compelling story about an incredibly brave and resilient woman. I give it 4 to 5 stars. I recommend it to anyone, though trigger warnings for sure for abuse and infant death. Yeah. The next book that I read was Dead Astronauts by Jeff VanderMeer. It's a sci-fi weird fiction. Yeah, I mean, if you know anything of Jeff VanderMeer, it's like weird. I actually bought this book from a bookstore. I have it. It's probably from Chapters. I should probably buy more things from independent stores, but I really wanted to take this on my trip, so I booted out to the mall and grabbed it back when people did that. So I love Jeff VanderMeer. Do you want to hear a funny story? Okay, it's not very funny, but it's kind of interesting. So my first introduction to Jeff VanderMeer was from this Halo short story collection. Yes, I read Halo. I love Halo. It's my guilty pleasure. I've only played like Halo 3. I haven't even played the other games in the series because I don't have an Xbox. We're a PlayStation family. Yeah, I love the books. I think my most liked Goodreads review is of Halo First Contact or Contact Harvest or whatever it is. Anyway, so Jeff and his wife wrote a short story. Sorry. Dogs. Jeff and his wife wrote a short story for this compilation, and it was so mind-blowingly good that I sought it out. I sought out his other works after that. It's called The Mona Lisa, if you want to know. As such, I have several of his books. They're over there. This general section is mainly the Jeff VanderMeer section. So I was excited for this one, but I don't buy hardcovers, so I have to wait for paperback. I don't buy hardcovers because I'm cheap. I'm not spending $35 on a book. I don't know if I'm going to like it. And I don't have a lot of space in here, okay? Clearly it's all filled with books. Anyway, I can't really explain what this is about, so I'm going to be boring and read the back cover. Under the watchful eye of the company, 3 characters, Grace and Moss and Chen, shapeshifters and forests, part human, part extensions of the landscape, make their way through forces that would consume them. A messianic blue fox who slips through warrens of time and space on a mysterious mission, a homeless woman haunted by a demon who finds the key to all things in a strange journal, a giant leviathan of a fish centuries old who hides a secret, remembering a past that may not be its own. 3 ragtag rebels waging an endless war for the fate of the world against an all-powerful corporation, a raving madman who wanders the desert lost in the past, haunted by his own creation, an invisible monster whose name he has forgotten, whose purpose remains hidden. So, does that make any sense? Probably not. As usual with any Jeff VanderMeer story, Dead Astronauts is both delightfully confounding and imaginative with provocative themes. It's a little more blatant in its message than those of the others I've read, all of them. But it isn't trite or heavy-handed in the novel's purpose, perhaps because it's so relevant today. As someone who cares extremely deeply about animal welfare, there are parts that were very painful to read, but in ways that aren't grotesque for shock or controversy's sake, but to remind us, who the true villains are in the real world. Spoiler alert, human beings. The novel also requires you to pay attention, as there are repeated images and themes that come into relevance later. It's a book that I enjoyed reading in long chunks, but not a few pages at a time or in one sitting. I wanted to be properly involved, but also to draw it out, so I had time to kind of ruminate on what I was reading. The different perspectives of the novel keep you guessing and engaged, while also kind of unraveling the trajectory of the story. I'm not going to call it a plot. He absolutely nails a second person, which is very hard to do successfully. It's so hard to do a second person. The characters, while we don't get a lot of time with them, are distinct and easy to understand their motivation. He gives us just enough of their backstory to understand and care about them, then he snatches that away. The way he wraps up all their fates in the end, which was nice. What I particularly liked is that we're given a vague idea of what the company is and what they've done. I found the lack of specifics and exposition to be fun, while also heightening the company's villainy in my own imagination. So I think encouraging the reader to extrapolate and make correlations on their own, that's kind of a staple of his work, and that's definitely something that this novel does. So I'm a fan of VanderMeer for all the reasons I mentioned above, but also for a startling, very specific and unique imagery, such as, I wrote it down, the smell gains a weight and misdirection, like rusted iron soaked in honeysuckle. So this is a really, bizarre description, but it works in a way that is very beautiful in its weirdness. So I gave it 4 to 5 stars, like pretty much everything in this month, and I recommend to anyone who doesn't mind a story that sometimes doesn't make sense and full of weird ass surreal metaphors and symbolism. So the last book that I read in January was Old Rendering Plant by Wolfgang Hilbig and translated by Isabel Fargo Cole. Do you want to laugh? Here is my attempt at pronouncing the German title with my 1 semester of German in university. Alte Abdeckerei Erzachlung. Is that correct? Anyone who speaks German, please correct me. My dad speaks German, so if he ever watches this, he'll probably laugh at me. Dad, don't watch my reviews. Anyway, how could I not read something called Old Rendering Plant? I don't know. You guys obviously haven't been following my reviews for a while because I've only started doing them, but I am obsessed with abandoned buildings. I am obsessed with wastelands. I am obsessed with, the remnants of old industry. Anyway, I found this book from this guy on Goodreads that I follow who always reads the weirdest and most obscure stuff. So I bought it simply because it's called Old Rendering Plant, or as my brother-in-law calls it, Stinky German Factory. I love this book because it's so goddamn weird, and because I love, as I've said, abandoned factories. So my cousin one time took me to a cheese factory in her small town that was, a derelict factory that she used to work at. She had the key because I guess she used to work there and it closed down. They didn't care who had the key anymore. It was super cool to be in this huge space that had absolutely no purpose anymore. Maybe that's also why I like the desert. Just kind of desolate. Anyway, this book is about a boy who spends his days in an old abandoned factory near his town because he's somewhat neglected and rather lonely. When he's a young man, also lonely, he travels back to the factory to find it's being used as a swine slaughtering plant. In the end, it burns down. Honestly, that's not a spoiler. He pretty much tells you this exactly from the start. That's the story. That's it. Nothing else happens. But this book is an experience. It wasn't deliberately confusing or obtuse in its prose or meaning, though it was rather cryptic. It's both a reflection and a condemnation of the state of industry and society in Germany during the Cold War. This would be an absolute fun book to study in more depth, especially given my own German heritage with a family divided by the Berlin Wall. I also read the novel as a metaphor for the narrator's psyche regarding his state of confusion, his futility, his loneliness in both his childhood and as a young man. He is the old rendering plant in a sense that he is an empty vessel. He's forgotten and alone at the beginning, but when he's adult, he and the plant are both filled with horrors and fear, as well as the festering vitriol at the center, which is his heart / the spoiler of it burning down. So the imagery and the descriptions are evocative and often disgusting. Given how many creatures my dog Ruger has killed that I've had to deal with, possum, skunk, squirrel, many rabbits, there's a section that, made me laugh kind of as well as empathize with the poor guy because I've seen this firsthand. So, there was that part too. I don't have much more else to say about it. It's a compact novel that's both off-putting and enticing, much like exploring abandoned ruins. So I give it 4 to 5 stars. I recommend it to nobody. Well, some people will like it. If you're like me, you might like it. If you're not like me, you'll hate it and you'll be like, what a stupid book. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with a couple passages that exemplify the tone and the prose, and if you hate it, I am so sorry, but whatever. So, the rushing void of time. Dog? The rushing void of time. While far away in the brown smolder of the eastern horizon, dead poplars reared up, plaintive verticals whose unalleviated prominence menacingly abjured the fading night like crucifixes whose arms had been hacked from their trunks. And then there's one where he talks about abandoned industrial ruins looming into the sky like rocky, storm-swept islands. They lay desolate and fallow. How could I not love this? Oh my god. Anyway, thank you for watching this, and I hope you enjoy the next part. Bye. Hi there. Welcome to Sound and Fury Book Reviews. My name is Tina, and today I'm going to be doing something a little different. Apparently wrap-ups are a big thing in booktubing. I've recently gone on a blitz adding a whole bunch of channels because it seems like such a fun community, and I also want to get some recommendations of things to read next. So anyway, I've decided to start doing a wrap-up every month of the stuff I've read, other than the old school sci-fi title that I, review and analyze. I may look like a bit of a bum today, because my dog Denny, as you know from my intro and stuff, he is at the vet getting some x-rays on his spine, so I'm very worried about him. So, for February, I hit 4 books that month. I usually do about a book a week. I mean, I'm busy. So the first book I read was The Rose, which is the feature of my most recent book review. It's basically an argument about art versus culture with a very loose plot. It would take me too much time to explain what the plot is without spoiling the whole thing. Basically, it's hardly a sci-fi. It's interesting, but not the most interesting thing in the world. The next book I read was The Brothers Karamazov. I hope that's how you say it. I can't speak Russian. By Dostoyesvy. If you aren't sure about what this book is, it's a classic Russian murder mystery novel where one brother is accused of murdering his father. The story is basically the build-up to the events that happened and then the trial that determines the outcome of his guilt or innocence. It's part story, part exploration of different themes. Dostoyevsky is very interested in things like human nature, truth, justice, the bonds of family, that kind of thing. His other famous one, Crime and Punishment. He follows the same theme a lot of the time. Usually I like long books. Anna Karenina? Again, Russian. Middlemarch by George Eliot, Ulysses, Proust, etc. I love all those big long books. But this one was just so tedious. It might have been that I have this weird translation. It has a publisher, but I could not find it on Goodreads. And it also says, I realized after that it's the authoritative modern abridgment. So did it cut out interesting things? I don't know. All I know is that my copy had a very disjointed dialogue, very hyperbolic romances. I didn't know enough about all the characters to really care about them, but I'm fully blaming the translation. There's a lot of translations out there of this book, and I think I just happened to pick the worst one ever. Most people love the book, so I recommend giving it a try, but, with an Oxford, or Penguin version maybe. Not this random one that I found at a yard sale. So, what else did I read? Well, every month I try to read one ebook that I get for free, like at ARC. Usually from NetGalley, Book Sirens, or I also do reviews of self-published novels on whisperingstories.com. So the one I did this month is The Sound of Stars by Alechia, which was a NetGalley special. It's YA. I tend not to read YA, but I try. I'm not fond of YA. It's dystopian. It's about this 17-year-old girl, Ellie, and an alien named Morris. I'm not going to get into why his name is Morris. It's also like the least attractive name. I'm sorry if your name is Morris. It's just like not a name that I like. Anyway, Morris's people have enslaved Earth a few years ago, but due to his love of, human music, which I think was not picked perfectly for the age group, because a lot of it's like David Bowie and things like that. I'm like, did the 15-year-olds know David Bowie? I don't know, probably, because he passed away a couple years ago, but I doubt it to be an extent that they were referencing it. But anyway, this alien ends up taking off with Ellie to save on a quest to save Earth. It's a YA novel. The plot's a bit basic. I give the whole thing like 3.5 out of 5. Unfortunately for it, the rest of the novel kind of sits with the plot and being just okay. There were things I loved. The main character is a woman of color with a physical disability. There's other diversity in the novel, non-binary characters, LGBTQ characters. There's a human and alien love story, which I particularly enjoy. Anyway, my issue with the alien love story in this story was that the aliens are apparently super hot versions of humans. Why do the aliens have to be super hot for us to want to fall in love with them? I mean, Gareth from Mass Effect is ugly as hell, and he is the hottest alien ever made. Or conceived, or designed. I don't know. Shameless plug, but the space opera trilogy that I'm working on right now has an ugly alien plus human romance in it. So keep your pants on for winter 2020 when it's going to come out. Yeah, I'm probably the only one who has trouble with that. So The Sound of Stars, that's what I'm talking about. The love story wasn't great because instead of focusing on what teenagers usually do, which is whether or not to take off their pants with one another, it's too much love going on, like they're 17, they're not in love, especially after like 4 days. So instead of like focusing on giving them an actual relationship, they just go on these monologues about being in love all the time. It's very boring. And also the plot doesn't have enough road trip aspects. What drew me to the novel was the fact that it was a road trip across the states. That's like one of my favorite things in the entire world is road trips. And so it fell very flat there. It does approach like larger social themes and it has an interesting story. There's a lot of background put into it. I think I'm just too old for it. I'm an old lady. I want to be 35. So old. The Light Brigade. Oh boy. I love Cameron Hurley. I love her. She's visceral. She's gross. She's gritty. She's so good at battle scenes. Everyone just blows up and there's guts everywhere and there's birthings and like, oh, it's so gnarly. I love it. So, The Light Brigade. No, not The Charge of the Light Brigade. The Tennyson poem that, I've always loved because I'm so literary. It's actually about a similar thing, though. I love the title for that. Soldiers, thrust into battle that they will most likely die in. And the premise of this story is that Dietz is a soldier who signed up for the war, after their city was blasted off Earth in an event they called the Blink. Their enemies are the colony of humans that have colonized Mars. So the whole war is about them versus Mars in different battle zones. The story follows their journey through boot camp to active duty to beyond that. It's like Starship Troopers meets The Day After Tomorrow. Everyone says that because that's the best comparison. The only difference is that instead of Tom Cruise, not a fan, you get Dietz, who is a dumbass for most of the novel, but they're conflicted and brainwashed, and they keep waking up in different time zones, or time in different times in linear time. They jump back and forth. It's a time travel story. What? Anyway, it's so much fun. It does waver a bit though into themes of today, like xenophobia and scapegoating and corporate control of society and government ineptitude and propaganda and fake news and classism. So, humans are terrible. This book does nothing to prove otherwise, but it's just a bit heavy-handed in that message. I'm all on board for what Hurley's arguing, not to the extent of the plot. Still, it's an absolute blast, though, of a sci-fi novel. Anyone who enjoys military sci-fi will enjoy it, and she's fantastic. Give her other books a try. The Stars of Legion is another one that I really love. Shout out to January. My favorite book from that month was Old Rendering Plant by Wolfgang Hilbig. But I also love Dead Astronauts by Jeff VanderMeer. I wish I'd started doing wrap-ups earlier because I would have loved to have talked about those two. They were great. They were fantastic. So the next book I'm going to read will be Apocalypse by Nancy Springer. I'm reading it right now, and believe me, this book is interesting. So I'm going to talk about that, and then I'll do a wrap-up for, what month are we in now? March. For March. And hopefully you'll get a video of Denny. I hope. Oh, this was supposed to make me feel better. Now I just feel sad. Anyway, feel free to like and subscribe if you want to. Bye! This is my monthly book wrap-up for March. The first book I read was Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo. Hope I'm saying that right. My sister, who is the one that always recommends to me great feminist books, told my mom to read the book, and then she borrowed it from the library and she loaned it to me, which is great because there's a bunch of holds on the book, so I got it early. Basically, it follows 11 women and one non-binary person from different cultures, backgrounds, and time periods in England, and how their race, sexuality, and gender impacted them, socially, sexually, and economically. So you understand where all of them are coming from, even though it's from different places, even if a few of them are kind of less than sympathetic. So I gave this book a solid 4 to 5 stars, as I found the overall structure interesting and the novel easy to read, but the premise or argument tended to overshadow the story. That being said, I spent one evening reading well past my bedtime, and there were parts that I reacted to emotionally. I did love how it took place in different time periods. That was really fun. You don't go into a book like this without expecting a feminist perspective. As such, Girl, Woman, Other is one of those books that wavers between novel and argument, as I mentioned before, a little too heavily. Girl, Woman, Other is blatantly in your face about carving space for women whose stories are often overlooked or lumped together. While we're getting far better now about having novels and movies featuring women and people of color, this novel tries to show why it's important to do so. And how you can't erase, centuries of racism or sexism in a couple of generations. It's not a linear journey, and marginalized people have their own prejudices to work through. I am giving it 5 stars, as I said, but by about the 9th woman in the story, I was getting kind of done with the whole thing. The novel's not a happy one, which is fine, but I was getting a little drained from it all. And also because we're only given a brief history of each character, they're often defined by a singular trauma in their life. And while everyone is shown to kind of get over it, it felt like everyone got over it a bit too simplistically, and every single woman was defined by her relationship status or revolved around motherhood. There was no one who didn't kind of have these two things as their primary concern, which seemed almost like a step backwards in what the novel was trying to say. I also found the format, because a lot of the sentences, all the sentences don't start with a capital, amongst other things. I found it very frustrating at first. I got used to it eventually, but I don't think the format contributed anything to the story, so I don't understand what the point of that was. If anyone has read this and kind of has a theory about the format, let me know. I'm sure there is a reason for it. I just found it kind of annoying and kind of frustrating. Anyway, though, good book, entertaining, and enlightening at times. The next book I read was Suzy, Spitfire, and the Snake Eyes of Venus by Joe Canzano. So this book is a sequel to this book, Suzy Spitfire Kills Everybody. This is a fun action-adventure about Suzy Spitfire Castillo and her mission to discover why her father was murdered. So this novel, the second one, is about Suzy trying to locate a serial killer on Venus, where she becomes embroiled in a revolution. I got my copy for free on Book Sirens, which is like another version of NetGalley. I actually use NetGalley and Book Sirens. So it's a pulpy, entertaining action-adventure with protagonists who have clear motivations and fun personalities. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, same as Girl, Woman, Other, which is kind of funny. The action scenes are always entertaining in this book and the previous one. Suzy's not some superhero, she's fallible, which creates good tension. The antagonists were a little flat in the story, though. Hunter, like the serial killer guy, was clearly a bad guy, but he wasn't in the story enough for me to really worry about him. And there was quite a few other characters that overwhelmed everything else that was going on. So there wasn't a clear antagonist to me, which is a little bit kind of frustrating. But the story was never confusing. The events played out quite logically, except for one thing. And Suzy's a fun character who is rash, risky, and independent. She does have a talent for violence, but she has conscience and regrets. The other side characters and their arcs were interesting too. The most interesting character in the novel is this newcomer named Chiara. At first, I found her a little annoying, but then it's revealed she's only 14. I'm like, oh, okay. She has the best arc in the story as she goes from victim blaming herself to realizing her situation and seeking help and escape. Suzy, despite her own violent nature, provides Chiara with this protective care that she was lacking and helps them both grow. Worry over Chiara was a major point of tension in the novel for me. And tied to that, the novel has some really nuanced comments about the exploitive nature of sex trafficking, especially regarding young people and how abuse functions in relationships. Often for showing an abusive relationship in media, especially in an action adventure, where even an abuser is so over the top, it detracts from the reality of abuse in real life. But the abuser in this case isn't depicted as someone who has no feelings or no remorse for what he's been doing. In fact, his warped love of his girlfriend breaks misleading stereotypes about what abusive relationships are like, and shows us society's implication in the perpetuation. The relationship is artfully done, as it's apparent to us, as outsiders, why the victim continually denies her status as such, even repeatedly claiming that, she owes him for rescuing her from a previous abuser, things like that, and then the sad logic behind the abuser's excuses for his own behavior. Quite frankly, these concepts surprised me in a book that I was expecting to be just a fun romp. That's not to say it isn't fun, though. It is a total fun novel. It's quick-paced, entertaining. It's an action-adventure, as I said, with interesting and diverse characters, a lot of cool technology, and a badass heroine. I really recommend it. Read the first one first, though. The next book I read was called Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This was loaned to me by my sister. So these are short stories all focused around women, female sexuality, and they branch from psychological realism to mystical sci-fi, to actual sci-fi, and to fantasy. I gave them about 3 to 5 stars kind of overall. Short stories are hard to review because, some of them were crappy, some of them were great. Of the 8 stories in this book, most were interesting and engaging, but there was none that would compel me to buy the book simply to have it on hand. So that's kind of why I gave it 3 out of 5. There's something in it that I was like, wow, this is the best short story I've read in my life. And while I value and enjoy feminist literature, a collection that is only dealing with these themes can grow a bit tiresome in the vein of compassion fatigue. Of course, I think it's important to have stories that show the societal pressures and obligations placed on women, but some of the stories in this book focused on this overplot, making it feel rather didactic. And a lot of the main characters felt like the same person to me, with a couple of exceptions. Like, I can't even tell you what my favorite story was, because I didn't have one that, as I said, I didn't have one that was kind of over the top, blew my mind. They were all well written and interesting, but for me, I didn't find them overly provocative, nor did I find them anything really new. I'm not sure who to even recommend this to. The next book I read was called Creeping Jenny by Jeff Noon. Completely different from the other 3. I got this novel on NetGalley. The basic premise is that it follows a detective who travels to a small town to solve the mystery of the disappearance of his father when he was a child. I gave this a 4 to 5 stars. That being said, I was not aware this was part of a series. I wish there had been some kind of indication, like in the preliminary pages or in the blurb, because that was kind of annoying. Like, the story was still engaging and interesting, but I felt like I was missing some integral details of Nyquist, that's the main character, his backstory, including what he looked like, and the fact that the story takes place in some alternate reality version of the 1960s England. Like, they completely don't explain that, and you're just like, alright, I guess, just accept this as it is. If the story had been intended to stand completely on its own, a little more exposition into his past life in this place called Day Zone, wherever that is, would have been very helpful. Yet, the story itself is self-contained enough that I was still extremely engaged with it. The mystery is awesome. The setting itself is wonderful. It's a rural town with shifty residents and this increasingly supernatural series of rituals they partake in every day. The people Nyquist meets are either perfectly quirky or subtly sinister, and it's evident that the town functions as normal and would, except for these strange ritual things that change every single day. You kind of have to suspend your disbelief about these rituals because some of them are really intense, but it's possible this sort of supernatural going on is common in Nyquist's kind of universe, but I wasn't aware of it because I hadn't read the previous 2 novels. I'm assuming it's the case because Nyquist himself doesn't seem overly weirded out by any of this, so I was like, okay, this must be normal for this guy. I liked that this novel had a personal focus to it. It gave Nyquist's actions a bit more logic. When he commits breaks and enters and other risky maneuvers, it's because he's desperate to learn about his father. He's not just doing a job. That being said, he's a little flat. While he fits the typical noir detective archetype, he's a little boring. He's either stoically plodding towards his goal, he's tired, or he's demanding answers from people who just willingly comply for the most part. There's, hints of sympathy about him, and he clearly is a good man, but the mystery of the town was far more compelling to me than him. The absolute best part about this novel, though, is the atmosphere. Jeff Noon manages to include well-known tropes of the genre, you know, witch in the woods, that kind of thing, but they don't come off as cliche. Like, he holds back a bit on them, and it doesn't quite reach horror levels, but the creepy ambiance pervades throughout the story in a way that makes it the star of the show. Overall, I wish I'd known there were 2 other books in this, but whatever. It was an enjoyable, creepy mystery that kept me wondering, and I recommend it. The last book I read was Mechanical Failure by Joe Zieja. Zieja? I'm not sure. I'm sorry. This book is a military sci-fi comedy about a man named Rogers forced to rejoin the Space Navy, where he becomes involved in a conspiracy of comedic proportions. I got this book for Christmas. It took me a while to get to it. I've given it a 3 out of 5, but it's more of a 2.5 out of 5 for me because it's not my type of humor. I love, for example, Andy Samberg's absurd movies. I love comedic banter, and I like most British comedy. I suppose I like to be surprised. Like, I love when humor comes out of nowhere. What I don't like is slapstick, comedy of errors, or when the entire premise is built on one joke that doesn't really sit with me. I don't like Christmas Vacation, for one. I'm like one of those people that, people put it on, I'm like, well, I guess I'll just go read. The book's plot and timeline move far too fast, and there are some jokes that go on for far too long. We hardly get to see Rogers in downtime, so we never learn much about him. He's likable, but he claims to be a lazy slacker, which I didn't really buy. Likewise, we don't get enough of the other characters, which also makes a few of the twists rather uninteresting, as there wasn't enough space to lay their foundation other than very thick, and therefore obvious. I didn't find it poorly written regarding writing style, and the novel picked up for me around the second half, as this is when the characters begin to play off one another. It does take about 40 pages for female characters to show up in the story. For a while I was getting worried. But when they did show up, I really liked how they were depicted. You know, they were competent, had as much depth as the male characters, which wasn't a lot. The only woman who is sexualized is Captain Allensbury, but this itself was a flip on an old trope. Instead of lusting after a caricature of a woman, in these stories, usually someone who's over the top, conventionally attractive, as well as brilliant, and always a league above the hero. Rogers goes completely gaga for a woman who is often described as having muscles filling door frames. So her appearance, though, is lauded as extremely sexy to Rogers. It's not a rude joke, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. I truly wish the novel had taken more time with other characters to build them up and let them play off one another. The banter between all of them really shines in the few scenes they interact as a group. Whenever Rogers was bumbling around on his own, I kept waiting for the others to come back onto the page. I mean, it was a fun book. I did enjoy it. It wasn't my type of humor. I recommend giving it a shot, if you get it from the library or something. It's just, humor's so subjective. So I feel bad, giving it a low grade based on my lack of a sense of humor. I did read one other book. I was going to talk about it more in depth. I used to do this booktube channel where I reviewed books. I'd review a sci-fi from anywhere from the 1950s to the 1990s. And then I'd really get into it and I'd talk about the portrayal of women or racial things, things that dated it but made it interesting at the same time. I really like to analyze texts, but I'd spent a lot of time including video, clips and, screenshots of things in there, and I didn't realize that pictures just taken randomly off Google are copyright infringement, so I have stopped making those. So I'm going to talk about Apocalypse by Nancy Springer next month, just as a regular review, because I have been so busy preparing my own book for release. I have a 2.5-year-old at home with me now who's currently napping, and so that means I get basically nothing done during the day. I'm suffering from extreme self-isolation envy. I wish I could be home alone for 2 weeks. It would be the best. I'm also 32 weeks pregnant, so by 7 p.m. I'm so dead tired that I can't do anything work related. So that's my excuse for not reviewing Apocalypse by Nancy Springer. But thanks for watching. I hope you liked my reviews. If you've read these books, feel free to add a comment. If you agree with me or disagree with me. I mean, everyone's opinions are their opinions, but I like to engage in conversations about books. And if you have anything that you recommend me to read, go right ahead. That'd be great. So again, I'm Tina, and thank you for watching. Ooh. This is Denny. He's my pug. He's old. He only has one eye. He's gross. I love them.